Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet.
Welcome to our 20th regular episode of Sustainable Planet. I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and my co-host is Jordan Dye, a guy who knows an awful lot about sustainability issues. Our earliest history is marked by the mineral ages. From the copper to the bronze to the iron, the story of humans' attempts to harness new resources continues today as countries vie to secure access to critical minerals. Yet the pursuit of these materials comes at a steep price, ranging from environmental degradation to ethical dilemmas about labor and resource extraction. So, Jordan, are we trading one environmental crisis for another in our race for critical minerals?
I think it's definitely fair to say that we're causing local environmental crises as we're trying to address a global catastrophe. It's really a hard trade-off in saying, but I don't think that as we move through the energy transition, we can ignore the impact that is being driven from our choices to go to a greener world.
I think that a lot of people feel like technology is going to be the answer to like all of our problems. And yet, when we look at these issues with critical minerals, and we should probably talk a little bit about what actual critical minerals are, right? But I think that you have all these people out here, well, technology could be our savior. Well, the problem is that to make this technology, we are dependent on these resources. And unless we harvest them in a sustainable way, are we to be actually saved by this technology?
100%. I think people also don't realize how much is necessary, to drive even just where we're at now in our modern world, right? And as you said, so probably should define critical minerals. The fun part about this is there is no universal accepted definition of what is a critical mineral. They're critical based on each specific country's drive for them. Although there are like 50 minerals that are roughly considered globally to be critical by the USA and the IEA. And I'm glad we got an actual A to Z on this because those minerals range from aluminum to zirconium. But most people, I think, can list off, if we push them, the most common critical minerals, because you hear about them quite often, from copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and then rare earth elements. And these are the ones that are really driving our technology today, from cell phones to computers. And where they're located and where we're getting them from are so far out of, I think, people's kind of day-to-day experience that it's easy just to say, well, of course we have more of them. We have enough. We've been mining gold forever. We can keep doing it. And that's, as I was talking to people about this episode, that was kind of the first response that I was getting was, well, yeah, of course, we need to expand more, but we can just go and open up new mines. And this may be the fact that I'm in Canada. And mining is a very big part of Canada, that it was just an initial, of course you can open another mine. But I was really surprised at how little the people I was talking to had actually thought about the importance of these.
And I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, which was coal mine. I didn't grow up in the coal mine region, but I grew up near, I won't say the derogatory term for people who come from the coal mine region. And also then moving and being a professor at Northern Kentucky University. I mean, Kentucky, coal in Kentucky is a huge resource too, right? So that's something that's always sort of been around where I've been, at least by proximity, if not directly. And I think it's interesting too, because I think a lot of people, especially in teaching students, when thinking about critical minerals, it was always their immediate association was just with, or response was always rare earth minerals, which are not the same, but the media regularly conflates critical minerals with rare earth minerals. So And the thing is, it's interesting, is they're not actually rare. It's just that they're super expensive to extract because of how they're not very concentrated, and you have to dig up a lot of ore to be able to extract these, and it's quite an expensive process. And so rare earth minerals are what more people are probably familiar with, but they're not even necessarily the group that are the most important. But the thing I think of that's interesting about them is that there are ones that are light earth minerals and heavy earth minerals. And the heavy earth minerals, that's kind of a scary scenario because China and Burma, Myanmar control and have almost 100% of those. And those are the ones that, especially for military defense, are the absolute necessary components.
Well, and that's just it. I think on one side, we can talk about the energy transition drivers that are driving kind of the mineral demand, and they're it's aluminum and lithium and copper that are really, and cobalt, sorry, that are really driving it. But people don't, like, for us, yes, that might be why they're critical. We want a new cell phone. We want a new computer. But as you noted, for countries, it's actually the military applications and the aerospace applications that are really driving the focus on rare earth elements. I was actually trying to find a way that we could contextualize how much material this is taking for the audience. And I found a great singular example because it's already so big. I didn't want to give others. But so looking in the American context, as of 2020, Americans purchased roughly 161 million new phones per year. And with there only, 330 million people, that's more than the full, like half the full population each year getting a new phone. The amount of material required to make those phones just for America each year is the equivalent of building a new Empire State Building every 6 days.
Wow. That's astonishing.
So and that's just phones. That's not laptops. That's not computers. That's not batteries. That's not cars. That's not wind turbines. And we can keep going down the list of that's not. And that's a new Empire State Building and not even 7. As I was looking at that, I went to double check the math because I was like, I'd like to say a week, but no, you get a few extra by the end of the year.
That's really something. Yeah. I mean, I think the reason that critical earth minerals get a lot of attention is because of their importance in technology and green energy. But the thing that I found that was, to me, was really interesting, especially as coming from an international relations background, was the military and aerospace, which to me, a lot of times for countries, they're sort of one and the same, right? Controlling airspace and aeronautic technology and so forth because of military concerns, security concerns. And so most people, like you said, on their mind, it's like, oh, well, what about, magnets I need for my, maybe people don't realize that the stereos and the everything requires magnets, right? Everything's magnetic and the various sophisticated electronics and electric cars, which now are becoming much more popular, right? Electronic vehicles and even renewable energy resources are on people's minds a little bit more, but it's really, and this is, again, why I kind of think this is a really fascinating topic is because what's really driving countries' interest in this are their security, actual military security needs, which is what's also pushing them to secure more of these resources and to subsidize, like with the United States, subsidize more of the processing at home for these resources.
Well, 100%. I think, and I'm excited to dive into this topic with you because of international relations are so big on it. But I think it's fair to say we're almost in a quiet mineral race right now, between countries.
A different sort of space race.
A different space race. Yeah. Well, the precursor almost in a way, because without it, you can't build what you need, or for countries' concerns, you're dependent on countries that can, I think the concern with security is always that in times of conflict, that supply would be restricted. And that's really what we're talking about when we say security is the long term. And unfortunately, for us, at least for, if you believe in that security reason, the West, and particularly the US, Canada, and our European partners have been behind on this game in comparison.
And Australia is sort of in the game, but they're behind in terms of processing.
Yes. Well, and so let's. I want to talk a little bit about how big this has gotten first, because it is I want to dive so quickly into the fact that it's actually the processing. The supply of it is much more distributed than the processing of these minerals, which is essentially owned by one country that most listeners will be able to guess. But just to set the context for how big this has gotten and where it's going, in the last 20 years, the demand for critical minerals of all types has grown by over 600%. And in the last 5 years alone, it's doubled, with another doubling projected by 2030. And that's just it was one of those times where I went with what's the status quo scenario, because that already seems drastic enough. Then when you start looking at if we're actually going to maintain, a global warming below 2 degrees, you're looking at a 4 times increase in the current production by 2040. And I think that's a little hard to even just imagine for my brain, for the amount of activity that's going on and how much would be required to do that.
And we should actually be shooting for 1.5 degrees, not 2. And then I keep seeing all of the all of these statistics have come out very recently about, because AI is just exploding, right? Mm-hmm. And all of the energy demands for AI and what impact this is going to have on greenhouse gas emissions. And so you take critical minerals and couple that with what's going on with AI and the energy necessary for that. And you look at these numbers at 2 degree Celsius doesn't even seem achievable at this point to me.
Well, no, and it's the challenge, because we don't think about the overlapping pressures. I think AI is really interesting because it drives data center growth is what you need for that. One of the issues that people don't think about in that connection is, for most data center customers, they have strong ESG goals. Like, the tech companies are actually some of the strongest kind of targets and investments in sustainability. So that's actually driving a lot of additional renewable energy development to secure power for these data centers. And then when you start looking into it, 85% of the mineral needs by weight in a solar kind of facility are aluminum, which, again, the majority of aluminum comes from 3 countries. That's right where we're getting it. And so I think there are reasonable questions that can be asked about, are we, putting resources to the most effective places? And also thinking about the unintended consequences of saying you need to do this in a green way. If we decide that AI is the thing that we want to do and it has to be done green, it actually drives a whole bunch of mineral pressures up the stream, right?
As I say, it actually brings it full circle back around in a different way too, right? Because one, you've got all of the demands for the clean energy to fuel the AI generation, but also it's people on devices, right? So there's that demand for the devices and the critical minerals that are necessary for those devices. And we look at, just semiconductors. I think that, silicone gets all of the attention for semiconductors, but gallium is also something that's really important because it is more efficient at higher voltages and frequencies than what silicon can handle. And it actually, there's a name for the wide band gap semiconductors, because they're used in everyday telecommunications, especially for 5G networks and electric vehicles, and for the defense industry, for modern radar and so forth. And China controls 86% of gallium, and it accounts for 98.8% of all refined gallium production. And so right now, when it comes to gallium exports from China, along with germanium, which is another kind of underdog, right, and antimony, the United States has been waste-alled out because of tensions over trade tariffs and threats that are only going to get worse and different. Tune into the politics, guys, if you want to know more. But for our purposes here, this is just the beginning, right? Since December, China started banning exports to the U.S. in response to crackdowns on China's chip sector. And in that short amount of time, antimony prices soared over 228% and over less than a year. And then more so since the December announcement. And so people are going bonkers for this stuff. And this is common in products like batteries and solar panels. And so when we look at that, what these policies are that are coming around and what's driving this demand, right? This is a big business. By 2026, the total value of the market is expected to be almost $10 billion.
Yeah, and I think it's not going anywhere. Too much of and whether or not, listeners agree with our views of where we should end up or how much should be built out. I think that's why the status quo numbers were really important, of saying it's going to double in 5 years anyways, is because regardless of your view of how we're going to develop, it's not going anywhere. And the only difference in scenarios is by how much are we doubling, tripling, or quadrupling. And so you mentioned a few of the more, I'd say, obscure, like, critical minerals, which are
the underdogs.
The underdogs, that you can't do without them, but they don't get a lot of the attention. But it's in the big ones that China is really dominating as well. You'd already mentioned around 90% of rare earth metals and manganese refinement. 100% of the global natural graphite refinement happens in China. But then going back to those kind of core minerals that we need, the aluminum, lithium, and cobalt, over half the world's refining of those 3 minerals are all in China. So this is, as I said at the top, China has been pursuing this strategy for 20 years, that they've been working towards securing mineral access and building refining capacity. Whereas, the US and Canada will love to tout their new critical mineral strategies. that have all been developed in the last 4 years.
Well, and the thing is that it made sense at the time with what was going on in the world, right? China was a cheap outsourcing place, cheap place for everything to come out of and processing and so forth. And the world was, the Cold War was sort of winding down and the world was opening up economically, and China eventually was allowed to join with lots of conditions that were never really enforced, the World Trade Organization. And it looked like things were moving in a direction where, hey, we're all going to get along, and this is okay that we're doing this and allowing China to have control over these assets. And it just economically makes a lot more sense to do this. And so mines that were in the United States, certainly, and I'm sure Canada as well, just sort of couldn't compete. And that was okay because of the way the world was then. But fast forward to now, and that's not okay anymore.
No, and I think it's particularly interesting if you look at the last 20 years of China's African foreign policy, and I have to admit, I had been for years, I've followed the infrastructure investment, and there's been a lot of problems that within African nations, China recalling loans, not meeting it, and from a layman's perspective on the foreign policy, it just kind of looked always like, China trying to secure access to an area of the world that the kind of West had honestly invested in. But as preparing for this, I didn't realize how much of those investments were connected to mineral access for the last 20, including the infrastructure investments that actually went through, because China notoriously has not actually met their commitments that they've signed with a lot of African nations. But the ones that they did do were all in support of getting minerals to ports, essentially, so they could get to China. And when you look using the Democratic Republic of Congo, China owns 15 out of the top 19 producing mines in the country. And these rights were granted as part of a $6 billion infrastructure deal in 2008, as coming out of the World Trade Organization acceptance. But auditors in the DRC have found that only $800 million of that $6 billion has actually been invested. And again, that was the $800 million needed to make the mines that they're operating connected to the global supply chain. And I think that as our countries kind of pivot back to Africa in the last couple of years, a big part of this will be, I think, making the case for better partnerships. And one of the exciting parts about this for me, though, is the actual ability for, in the outline, I put it as new superpowers, right? I think the 20th century is really the story of oil superpowers. And I do think that as we look ahead at the next 80 years, the story of the 21st century is going to be mineral superpowers.
But I think that one thing is the United States has actually been has more foreign direct investment into Africa than China does, but oftentimes that gets obscured because of the stories that come out about what's going on with the Belt and Road Initiative, and because I think also part of it is just because of all of the attention that the exploitation of what's going on with Africa and Chinese exploitation in African countries. I visited some of these places and have seen there's a lot of local resistance to the Chinese coming in to their communities. They set up diasporas. They don't interact well with the locals at all. If the locals feel very exploited by what's going on, but at the same time, they're sort of receptive to Chinese investment because they get roads and they get other resources that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. And I think a few things are going on too. I think that some of the investment that goes into these African countries from the United States tends to be more along the lines of white collar investments, right? Services and industry, rather than we've seen a number of U.S. companies and other countries' companies leaving leaving Africa because of just, it's too difficult, right? People who want to have standards, it's just too difficult to work in these places. Like the DRC is completely lawless, right? This is a country that has regularly had to call in the United Nations, and there have been U.S. peacekeeping troops in Democratic Republic of Congo for I don't know how many years at this point, right? And so it's just really hard to work there. But for a country that doesn't have a lot of scruples, whatever, just, turn a blind eye to what's going on. And we see a lot of accounts of Chinese exploitation of labor and child labor and environmental degradation and so forth happening in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and other other countries, Zimbabwe and so forth, where they've been. And it's just like, the Western countries, the global North countries haven't really stood up to China because so far these countries have gotten the benefits from this. But now where there's a concern, like, okay, maybe we should rethink our policies, right?
It shifts the attention, right? And to your point, it's a lot easier for a state-owned company to say, we are going to stay here no matter what, and if there's a war this year that stops production, that's just this year, will be, next year. Or saying that, we'll align with those groups that are doing that if we can keep the mine going. It's a lot harder for a publicly traded company with shares. And I think especially when you look at the scandals in the mining industry over the last 30 years, especially more so, I'd say in South America, from the Canadian context, we've seen a lot of scandals in that way. But there's like just a lot of awareness of it now for those companies, right? So to your point, if a country is seen as unstable or a risky investment, then they're not going. And to the detriment of these countries, if they're seen as a risky investment or they're seen as an unstable environment, then it will be just extraction, right? Because companies will go in for a shorter period of time, will extract those resources, and will ship them out of the country. And so you don't see the investments in the refining capacity that we would want to be able to build stable economic growth for those countries.
Yeah, and it's exactly the way that this works, because foreign direct investment is not going to go in. Like companies aren't going to spend lots of money in places that are unstable. They just aren't going to get that return on their investment that's necessary. And this ties in absolutely to sustainability, because we're talking about what sorts of the Western companies typically abide by whatever laws they are set up, are governed by in their home countries. And so they go in, they have decent labor standards, they follow, environmental policies and so forth. They're not just there to trash the place. Whereas, if you're following Chinese policies, they're barely enforced in China, and then you go somewhere else, they're not going to be enforced in all labor or we see what the labor violations in China too. And so when it comes to sustainability issues, these are absolutely relevant, pertinent issues there.
And I think this is a big reason why in the recent strategies out of the US, which is just kind of the anchor for the global West, there's been a heavy focus on Canada and Mexico's resources as a way of securing never being able to match African or Chinese production and refinement, but as a core component of basically uninterrupted supply, right? And I think that is really reinforcing some of the longstanding ties between our countries at a time when those might be being challenged.
Yeah, I'm concerned what direction things may be headed with our next administration coming in those terms, because I feel like exactly what you're saying, like that the United States, Mexico, and Canada should be doing nothing but working more and integrating more in terms of supply chain and securing resources, because these are countries that actually have these things too. And it's the processing. That's the thing that a lot of people, where are these minerals located? Where are these resources? That's absolutely part of it. Yeah, China's got heaps and tons of critical minerals, but Australia's got a lot too. The United States even has a lot. Canada's got a lot, right? But the thing is that it's not only about the where these are, but it's about the processing and production of these minerals and where that happens. And right now, Chinese mines account for about 60% of the world's rare earth minerals and 90% of global processing. So it's one thing to have them. It's another thing to be able to actually turn them around. And it's crazy how much China controls this industry. Like, companies supply 80% of the world's battery cells and 60% of the total electric vehicle battery market. That's just crazy when you think about these numbers. But when you look at the history of it, it makes sense why it happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it leads into a flaw in some of our current energy transition plans for both, Canada, America, and Europe, looking at increasing their production of, wind turbines, solar cells, and EV batteries in country, which is, a laudable goal for a lot of reasons. But also, I think that it ignores the actual upstream problem. Because if you're diversifying that downstream end product supply chain, that's good. But if at the end of the day, every one of those companies is still going back to the Chinese company to get the minerals, we haven't really actually built in any more security to the system, because you can still just interrupt that at the higher level.
Yeah. And, we look at the environmental issues with this. We look at So it's not just about the mining impacts, right? It's also about water usage. So we've got the degradation and the biodiversity impact and also what goes on in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. But a lot of times it's that other side of it, water usage, that gets ignored because it's not just pollution, but it's the mining and processing. 16% of critical mineral mines are located in areas that are already facing high or extremely high water stress. In places like California in the U.S. Southwest and various places in India and Chile and China, these are places, like mining uses at least 40% of their water supply each year.
There's a significant amount of water use, and then you add in the pollution. So it's like, I think you add in both, and this is stressing, as you pointed out, already critically stressed areas, right? And the unfortunate reality of this is often these large economic projects that can be pointed to for so much success, or can be a politician's almost re-election campaign in some ways, saying, look what I've done for the economy, look what I've done for GDP. And in that way, the kind of water issue often gets pushed to the side, even at that local level, in sacrifice to some more immediate goals. And I think that this is really seen, especially going back to the DRC and China's involvement around those mines. I saw a great report out that they visited 20 out of 25 communities surrounding the 3 largest cobalt mines in the country, and every single one of them had increased respiratory problems, increased hormonal problems, and increased rates of cancer. All issues we typically see associated with pollution from mining regions.
And I think too that along those lines, we see these other social issues that go along with that, especially Chinese companies mining in Africa, that we've got the labor exploitation, the child labor, that there are numerous reports where U.S. or other global North countries had been running mines in countries in Africa, and ended up, once those companies got sold off, they left, and Chinese companies took over. Worker safety declined drastically. Environmental degradation increased dramatically, right? So we see that going along hand in hand with this.
But I did want to point out that this isn't just a problem we're seeing in the global south. So especially, using Canada as an example, like I mentioned, we have 32 critical minerals that have been identified as strategic for the Canadian and American governments and are rapidly investing in building out mining supply. It is the Canadian story of, we have a resource, we can extract it and sell it to America. That is the last 200 years of our history. But it's already running into clashes with the need for that mineral security and respecting rights of indigenous populations. Just 2 examples. So in the Yukon, the territory that is actually my home territory, the Kudzakaya mine in the Cascadene territory is also overlapping critical caribou territory. So in their calving and rutting grounds. In a very sad irony, the name of the mine is the Kudzakaya mine. It actually means caribou country in the Cascadene language. So I don't know. It was a little too on the nose for me. And this is a big issue because caribou have been listed as a threatened species since 2003 in Canada, with an open acknowledgement that their remaining territory is critical for species survival. Yet that mine was approved against the objection of both bands of the Cascadene. And then when you look at another province, Manitoba in Canada, there's currently ongoing exploration for a new mine in a provincial park, in a provincial park that is one of the largest areas for caribou calving, rutting, and summering territory in the region. And so, we are definitely seeing this in global south countries, but it's also honestly still happening in our own countries as we race to, again, you say the word security and military needs, and suddenly I think a lot of things get traded off without appropriately looking at, is this where it should be? And I get that these are hard questions because we do need the minerals, as we started at the top. But I don't think you can ignore, again, indigenous rights or the damages that are happening.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Is, as we started at the onset of the show, what is the trade-off, right? Because the trade-off is, we see countries like Canada, the United States, And Australia and others that want to protect natural resources have laws in place and yet end up defying their own laws and policies to go, well, it's really important. This sort of necessitates and we have to override these interests because if we don't, well, then we're going to be behind China or we're not going to, we may even have military threats from China.
Mm-hmm. And I think we would be remiss on the social side of not pointing out that the mining industry has decades long. The amount of research on the impacts of women in communities from mining moving into the region is just, Google Scholar search that and spend the next 10 years looking over the literature. It's kind of depressing. And it's not limited to domestic violence. It's also in the workplace and in the community that the rapid influx of unattached males into regions of the world that don't have the infrastructure to support that puts tremendous pressure both on the community and tremendous amount of harm on the women in the area.
Absolutely so. And so what do we do? So what are some of the sustainable solutions and innovations that we've seen happening here?
So the big one I want to start with, because it's not great, is recycling. Everybody always goes to, well, it's funny. It was reduce, reuse, then recycle. Yeah, we always seem to start with, well, how's recycling going? And honestly, critical mineral recycling is not a major player yet. There are about 13 billion kilograms of e-waste. I could not convert that to pounds for the Americans in the room. And though 13 billion kilograms of e-waste collected each year, but only 7.8 billion of that is lost as just waste in the process. So over half of the material collected doesn't turn into anything. And that's roughly 1 billion kilograms of metal too. So not even like just saying, oh, it's the plastic. It's actually valuable resources that are being thrown away. A big problem when I was looking into why isn't this bigger is the same things we see in all recycling. Lack of supply chains, lack of similar feedstock. So especially with e-waste, that's a term that captures everything from the computer monitor that I'm looking at to the TV behind me and the phone and the mic we're recording on. It's all handled differently, treated differently. But also there's been some really bad reports of how this can be done in a very bad way. So looking at Apple's recycling program, they actually filed a lawsuit with their recycling company because the recycling company did not destroy all the products. They actually found over 100,000 items that were refurbishable. So the recycling company fixed them and resold them. And Apple actually launched a lawsuit because what they meant by recycling was destroy every product so it can't be reused.
Yeah, right. Not reuse. Yeah. Reduce, recycle, but recycle?
No, yeah. Remove from system.
Yeah, exactly. Remove would be the better R, I guess, to go with what was going on there. Yeah.
Yeah. And looking ahead, the IEA only estimates that 10% of global demand for critical minerals will be filled by recycled materials by 2040. So any estimate I could find was actually smaller than that. It appears the IEA had quite a high one, but it doesn't appear that recycling is going to be a path forward on this issue.
And what is the IEA for everybody who doesn't know that? Because you're daily lingo, I know, right?
Yes, the International Energy Agency. It was formed in response to OPEC and the research out of there, and it acts essentially as the Western or democratic world's think tank on energy issues. So when we're looking for forecasts of energy usage or the energy transition, I think always a great place to start is the IEA. You get a very broad-based and neutral look at the topic.
Yeah, because it's actually an organization that came out of the OECD, so many acronyms of international relations, right? The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development of the most economically advanced countries in the world, who actually also account for 75% of all of the world's energy usage, right? So not a lot of countries using a whole lot of energy. So of course, this ends up being something that, while one of the big concerns at the time was in the 70s with the OPEC crises, now that we're turning to alternative renewable energy sources and still dealing with the OPEC countries, yeah?
So I actually had a question for you on this that I really wanted to get your take on. And that's, when I looked into this, it was interesting how much it just came back to governments need to do something. Governments need to do something. And this will only happen with The amount of times I saw regional and international cooperation as the like top line what's needed. And for the listeners, they can't see the facial reaction to this. But I wanted to ask, because I think we're seeing this over and over in issues now that we keep diving into, is the top line is that governments around the world need to do something. So do you see any momentum on mining or on critical minerals beyond getting more of them?
Well, I say there's sort of two things going on, especially in the United States. One is that there's more money that's going toward funding extraction and processing of critical minerals in the United States because of the threats and the relations with China and threats of being cut off. And so in terms of recycling, that more money is going into subsidies for refineries. So taking that e-waste and instead of just jettisoning it across the ocean somewhere else to let them deal with the problem. For example, I was really surprised to find the nth cycle refinery just opened near Cincinnati in September of 2024 to extract nickel and cobalt from shredded lithium ion batteries and scrap nickel from all of the new car batteries that are coming out from electric. That was a big concern, right, with electric vehicles, with what are you going to do with these batteries after the fact? So here's one source, but also the huge source we have coming from consumer electronics. And right now, like I mentioned, most of them have been shipped overseas and still are, unfortunately, but there's a big push now to have more of these companies in the United States that are going to try to harvest these. And the problem is it's quite expensive because to be able to get a pure enough quality and quantity of lithium, it has to be like 95.95% pure enough to make a battery. So there's a lot of funding that's gone into with the Inflation Reduction Act. $7.2 million went just into this nth cycle recycling center to try to get it up and running. And there are some more of those happening in the United States. Another instance is money that the United States has dumped into, again, largely for military security reasons, but also recognizing supply chain cutoffs and how important it is for consumer goods too, for responsible mining practices, right? So there's an interesting history of a rare earths elements mine in California that ended up closing in 2002 because it couldn't compete with China. And so eventually MP Materials revitalized the site. And now it's only one of 3% of all mining operations that recover and recycle processing water. So this mine produces 15% of all processed rare earth minerals in the world. Produces about 15% of all rare earth minerals in the world, which shows that it's actually possible to be responsible and profitable because of all of the hoops, all of the hoops it had to jump through to be able to operate in the United States and get be sustainable.
No, and I think another great example of this, of finding old resources that kind of, we can either reinstate or use in a new way, is in Canada. And I know in the States, there are lithium deposits found at the bottom of oil wells. It's quite common. So using methods of extracting, basically brine flushing and then extracting out the lithium from that, is a way of also accomplishing two, I think, important sustainability challenges. One, getting more lithium, but also a lot of these old well sites that aren't properly reclaimed and haven't been dealt with, they're uneconomical. They're usually passed off onto a regulator. So finding a new way to get an economic life out of them and requiring reclamation at a better standard than maybe we did 30 years ago, I think is an opportunity for ways to look at how can we meet the challenges of critical minerals, but also improve our sustainability of our country.
So with these responsible mining practices, the United States putting money and subsidies into backing operations like MP Materials to revitalize the site and to have processed, like actually recycling and reclaiming the water that it's using in processing, is doing this in the U.S. and now produces about 15% of all processed rare earth minerals. So it's possible to be profitable and responsible, but it's also backing the mines in other countries too. So there's the Lynas Rare Earths mining company in Australia. It opened in 2023 and it gets U.S. government subsidies. And it's also profitable, and it follows certified ISOs, which are the International Organization of Standardization, which I'm sure you are familiar with, but most people probably aren't. for environmental practices. And so this is something that's really, moving in that direction of recognizing, hey, we need to be much more responsible about how we extract critical minerals and for both environmental and labor practices.
Yeah, no, I think ISOs are probably the most impactful documents that no one knows runs their lives. That's how I would often explain them to people. But no, I think this is really important because you mentioned earlier the fact that actually it's the large multinationals now are actually running some of the most responsible mining practices. So when you look into a lot of the issues we can see in these countries, it's small scale mining that's causing a lot of problems. Maybe because of the sand episode, I've started to find this one, where in the world are black markets of sustainability? And I found one everywhere. Rare earth metals, black markets in China, cobalt black markets in the Congo, gold in the Amazon, and interestingly enough, mercury in the Amazon, because mercury is a really important mineral for small scale gold extraction, which large mines typically do not use anymore because of you're mining another mineral, but it's also the environmental damage and what you open yourself up to in liabilities. But for those, and I found it interesting that it's referred to as artisanal mining around the globe, and every time I looked into it, it wasn't what you'd think of as artisanal. This was not bakery fresh. It was the same thing we saw in the sand issue, which is people going out and doing this themselves in their side time, which leads to far greater impacts in a lot of ways than these public companies, which we can put pressure on and have been putting pressure on to improve mining practices for a long time now.
Yeah. And so along with that, we have the fact, though, that in order for these companies to be able to do this, they have to have government subsidies. Otherwise, they just can't be competitive, right? So there's that. But now there's incentive for governments in global north countries to actually give them this money. We also have some new methods of extraction, like direct lithium extraction that decreases freshwater usage and pollution. But again, that's something that's, costly. The upfront cost is a lot more. You mentioned brine water, and there's a method that uses brine water. And while there's no shortage of salt water, of course, right, it's everywhere, it's not water that is going to be used for drinking unless it's desalinated, which is an entirely different episode and really nasty business. Or for agriculture, mass withdrawal can actually cause brine water to end up mixing with fresh water, and then it contaminates it. So it actually ends up salinating the potable water. So that's, work needs to be done on that too. And then also using microbial technologies, right, to remove toxins from mining waste and reducing overall water usage and limiting water contamination and so forth. So there are some promising things out there. But again, it's like, where do you get the startup money to really scale these up?
Yeah, and I think that's going to be really key. Unlike some of the other topics we talked about where I think lots is happening, I think critical mining in general and critical minerals, we're at an inflection point, right? Because there's so much pressure placed on this and we know it's going to grow. It's so important now for the governments that are looking at this and saying this is critical to build in sustainable practices as the requirement. I don't think, going back to the question you asked me to start this episode off, are we trading one environmental crisis for another? And I think the more fair answer would be we might be. And it is up to us and our governments to make sure that the adequate pressure is placed so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
Well, and you mentioned mercury in mining. The Minamata Convention had gone through some years ago and overwhelmingly supported by countries around the world, recognizing that mercury was just scary biscuits when it comes to any sort of processing and so forth. And yet here's something that we see because, as you'd mentioned, when it comes to small scale operations and artisanal mines, these are much more proliferate around the world. Proliferate?
Prolific.
Prolific. God. So when we look at artisanal and small scale operations around the world, they're much more prolific when it comes to developing countries because they don't get that foreign direct investment. They don't necessarily have the rule of law that encourages big companies to come in. So you see these small operations, and yet they're supplying like 15 to 30% of cobalt exports just out of the DRC, right? And the fact that it's difficult to get an accurate number itself is quite telling, right? They're a lot harder to regulate than big companies that are, even if they're headquartered in global north countries like Glencore, right? It's the biggest cobalt mining company in the world, but when they're not the ones who are out there doing that small scale mining. So there's a lot of small scale mining that's going on that's contributing to pollution and contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and labor exploitation. I've actually seen mining operations in a number of countries I've visited. I mean, like, I didn't go in and visit actual mines or anything, but it was evident from being in local communities and talking to locals and visiting the areas that the conditions are just horrendous.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's just going to continue because companies, it gets washed in the supply chain is another big problem of this. I think in some ways, if it was more transparent, you can hold companies to account at the high end, right? And they can place pressure down. But because that 10 kilos that I mine of cobalt gets added into 5 from this person, 10 from this person, 100 from that smaller company, and then all shipped up to a bigger distributor. And by the time you get 4 steps down the supply chain, there's no way of even telling where it actually came from. One thing I found that gave me some, I guess, excitement. So African nations are now starting to ban export of raw materials. So Zimbabwe and Namibia have both banned the export of raw lithium. You have to refine it in country. And one of the biggest drivers and barriers is local demand. And that was constantly cited throughout the critical mineral work, is that a barrier to Africa developing refinement capacity locally is local demand for those end minerals. Now, why it's exciting to me is because of the demand in energy transition. So when we look, if we can increase the build out of renewable energy, of electric vehicles, of transmission lines in Africa as a whole, that can actually supply the regional demand that you need for those refined, which can support initial investments in refinement. So I think while it's back to that inflection point, right? We're at a point where it's not happening now, but you can easily see next 100 years where this develops in a great way and can provide both sustainable development, but economic security for these countries.
I was really interested when I was in Namibia to see that the government managed to secure 50% ownership rights for a number of its mines, diamond mines and various other mines. I mean, it would have to be like a case study of interesting history of Namibia being a newer country and when it broke away from South Africa and various other factors. But I think that Namibia and Botswana was another one. They're both actually countries that have been democratic, haven't had coups, like stuff like that, a better position to do this. But when you look at a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Zimbabwe, you're looking at like disastrous, like failed state in the case of both of them. And so well, Zimbabwe is not technically a failed state, but it might as well be. And so when we look at these issues, I don't know, like you asked me about the sort of tensions of, there's that idealist in me that the international law and so forth is going to prevail. Like that's what should be governing. But when we start looking at the individual cases of all of these things, how it plays out, even something that was as well supported as the Minamata Convention by countries practically unanimously around the world, when you see that at the local level, it's not, the enforceability is just not there. And when you look at these countries like Namibia and what's the other one you mentioned?
Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe, right? Zimbabwe, that when you look at those countries, how much leverage do they really have? And so when push comes to shove, they need hard currency coming in. And so they're going to take the deal regardless of, which is the thing that bums me out every time. And that's why development work was just so difficult and challenging.
No, and it's such a great perspective. That's why I was excited to ask you, because the second I see the top of every list being government action, I generally get a little disappointed because I don't think it'll happen. Maybe turning this back to us as individuals, because this is one of the most removed topics too, that, from actual choices. Anything that makes you, I guess, hopeful or ways that you think we can reduce impact?
I think that we can be hopeful that, like you mentioned earlier, that industries recognize the need and the economic potential, and even government subsidies are supporting the recycling for critical minerals and better extraction, more responsible extraction. That being said, demand for strategic minerals far outstrips supply. And so how soon can this actually happen? So I'm kind of like, And then there's also the concern that demand for critical minerals for clean energy technologies is growing so rapidly that anyone, anywhere is going to fill that void. If there's a demand for something, somebody's going to supply it. And unfortunately, it's probably going to be in a very unsustainable way. just to get it out there as quickly as possible. And then, it seems like to me, part of me wants to say China's kind of our hope, which is China's better positioned and has a lot better incentives to move in sustainable directions vis-a-vis a lot of other global north countries, because right now it's got the economic payoff for developing clean energy technologies. Like that's going to pay off for China, and it brings in hard currencies for its exports. And it's also, like there's a key to China's domestic sector. So they need to improve for their own population's standard. They have to have some level standard of living, because there will be a revolution if you can't maintain that. And people have gotten used to a fairly decent standard of living, especially in the very populated areas in the eastern part of China. And so, and also avoiding destroying its own environment, because if you don't have that stuff, if you destroy that, then what do you have? And they introduced a green mining program in 2020. And so by 2023, 1,250 of its 40,000 mines were green, which is, I did the math, and that's 0.01% of its mines. But still, that's something China put in place that they didn't have to, and they did, right? So they put a critical minerals law, resources law into place in 1986, and it did absolutely nothing but just sit there until 2009. And now it mandates that companies actually prepare ecological restoration plans before the mining begins, but they don't really seem to have done much to enforce that. So again, it's about, that disconnect between having the law in place and actually having it enforced. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about the international level with intergovernmental organizations, like we've got, the UN Energy, we've got the what other IGOs are there? The IEA, right, that you mentioned, the International Energy Agency. We've got the International International Organization for Standardization that we talked about. There are other non-governmental organizations like the International Council on Mining and Minerals and others like that, Initiative for Responsible Mining Association, that are pushing governments, pushing corporations for better, more responsible mining. But we see that disconnect between, okay, where are these policies happen and what's actually happening on the ground? So that's not very hopeful, is it?
No, but I think this is one of the more tough issues because of all of the factors that are driving into it. Like you said, the demand is there. It's rapidly increasing. It's not going anywhere. And that often just draws bad outcomes out of the system. I do think that it's a great point on China. And I think often overlooked is that, regardless of political ideology, having clean water and, a decent environment for your populace is something that you see around the globe and leads to political pressure. And as you pointed out, China didn't have to put in a lot of those policies. Another, a downside of I'd say an authoritarian system is that like lack of input. The upside to it is when they make a decision, they can say, we're rolling this out. So that will to enforce is there. I think you could see a lot of improvements. I think my hope for me looking at this is the African nations and how critical this is. And because of I think that this is a unique opportunity internationally for African nations to play off China and America in a sense, right? To secure better deals and to actually retain more of the value. The same way I keep saying I'm hesitant on this hope because I think that history and a lot of the pressure will probably, mute a lot of it and we won't see it. But I think it opens up an opportunity that hasn't really been there. And I'd love to see it pursued in a sustainable way.
It would be awesome if the African Union would actually be able to be a much more coherent organization, like along the lines of the European Union, because they could do so much with what the continent has got. But it's like why nobody knows what ASEAN is, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, right? We've got these really productive countries in Southeast Asia that if they would actually band together, they could actually balance, they can't fully balance the power of China, but they could do a lot more collectively than what they can do individually. And yet they keep selling out because it's like, highest bidder. Okay, well, we'll sell out and we'll work with China and forget the rest of you, even though they would be much better, that security in numbers. Mm-hmm. I think for me, I think it's encouraging. I do actually find a bit of hope in all of this. And it's encouraging that Australia is a big producer of some of the key minerals. We didn't talk a whole lot about really how much Australia has got, but it has some really key minerals and is moving toward processing more of these, like I mentioned with the Linus and U.S. investments in this company that now also has opened another mining processing company in Malaysia, which got backing from Australia and Japan, because these countries, along with South Korea and the United States, are coming together to try to balance China. And so they are also being held to higher environmental and labor standards. And so I think with Australia and everything Australia has to offer, in the United States cooperation with Australia and Canada and other places that have the minerals, now it's a matter of getting the processing in order, right? And in Australia, the government's invested over $2 billion as coordinating with the U.S. and other global north countries and Europe and so forth to move in this direction to become a little bit more independent. And they are absolutely far more bound by environmental regulations and labor regulations, right? So I think that and this goes back to what we started with, because these are national security issues, like they're national security issues, therefore these military concerns are driving the fact that these things need to get done, and they are held to these higher environmental and labor standards. And so therefore, that's a little bit more hopeful for me.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And the other is thinking about remembering that at the end of the day, we drive the demand. I think like through this entire conversation, we've talked about it at the kind of, 30,000 foot level of where are we getting these minerals and what they're using for. But going back to the cell phone example that I used, with the Empire State Building, the other side of that was that if every American, and so just using that as the example, could extend the life of their phone by 1 year. So just, you want to get rid of it, broken screen, make it last one more year. Everyone did that. It's the equivalent of taking off 600,000 cars in terms of GHG emission per year from the road. So it is also a point where, small changes, again, can have cascading and cumulative impact. So when thinking about how can we help in this, right? Because again, you and I are not going to be on the next international kind of panel picking together the rules, but the TV that flickers behind me every 4 days, well, I'm going to wait until it's, flickering every time I turn it on before I get rid of it. And again, we often don't think about how much that can actually add up in the long run.
Yeah, I held out, and after 9 years, had to finally get a new iPad, my only Mac thing in my life. And yeah, that it couldn't multitask anymore was its problem. I couldn't run more than anything on it at one time. And so I finally just caved and did that. But another thing too is companies like Apple allowing screens to be changed, like having new screens put in, because that's the biggest problem with phones, right? Phone replacement is the screen is cracked. And so having better screens and so forth. And while it's not in Apple's immediate economic interest because of the short-term gains, long-term gains are going to be a lot better. And so I think that there's that incentive too for corporations to be, that's also responsibility as well.
100%. And that's the finding little things that they can do. Not every company is going to fix everything, but this ties into a really interesting topic of right to repair laws. It's actually, it came up last week. My brother had an appliance break on him, and he's used it every day for 2 years now. And he was like, "Oh, this is good. I'll get a new one. I got my value out of it." And we both kind of stopped and thought about how when we were kids, there would have actually been a panel in the back, and you would have had a manual on like where to oil that fan so that it gets 5 years. And I think that there's just some simple design changes on the company side, but then us as consumers saying, willing to repair stuff. I'm willing to put in a little more work to extend the life of this and not use as much.
Well, with that, there is certainly an entire episode just on that, right? Because that's such a complicated and complex topic when it comes to right to repair and available. I mean, in fact, actually, the last episode you mentioned about just having the skilled laborers, the skilled workers to be able to do these repairs. So yeah, that's a can of worms for another episode, I think.
Definitely.
So if you enjoyed our episode of Sustainable Planet, or even if you didn't, let us know at splanetpod@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You'll find these links in our show notes on our website at splanetpod.com, along with additional resources from today's episode. You can read more on my Substack post. We'd really appreciate if you'd rate and review Sustainable Planet on your podcast app. It only takes a minute and it'll really help us out. Thanks for listening and have a sustainable day.